I'm very happy to be here. A little bit surprised, to be honest, and I was intrigued when I got the call a few weeks ago to be an invited speaker and come and share with you some of the findings and the work that I'm doing. Intrigued by how this fits to the public sector procurement. The outsider view may be a little conservative in terms of what the public sector can and can't do. In my own exposure, I've worked with public sector initially in my career. When I was in mechanical contracting, I was on the giving end, so I was bidding for public jobs. And then recently, about a year ago, I started to work with hospitals, public hospitals, to help them improve their operations so essentially they can address some of their budget constraints. So I'm curious to see how this fits in. I guess as a bit of background information, I wear two hats. At Novaratis, I am the global head of productivity strategy and PMO, which essentially looks at how to manage the entire cost of the company. And also what I do is I'm an executive partner for corporate research with the Institute of Supply Chain Management. And there's someone that I brought on board about 4 years ago. Until 4 years ago, I was managing all of our global operations, our global regions. And we kept getting a push to save more money, get an extra 100 million here, one extra 150, to the point where you could not lemon squeeze your way to more. It's just at some point it's dry. So you got to do something different. So I set out to find what the strategy for procurement would be. It took about 2 years to do that, tested different things, produced it. In the midst of that, created a new organization called Global Productivity and Business Services. I'll tell you about this in a second. And for the last 2 years, I've been piloting the concepts, two of my concepts that I'll share with you. One is managing the entire cost base, not just the third-party spend. And the second is actually taking our internal capabilities and offering them externally to our customers as a value-added service. So how do you get procurement to drive top-line growth? That's one of the avenues for growth. So I guess from my perception today, what I'm hoping is to share with you my concepts, also the experience. I'm hoping to give you some thoughts, spark some discussions. Certainly want to make it interactive. Add, challenge, just don't throw things, but yeah, essentially just add your point of view. So widen your horizons a little bit would be absolutely key. But very specifically, I'm hoping that you get one or two takeaways that you can actually take back and apply in your day jobs that you would be able to see some kind of benefits. Okay, so that's kind of my aim for the session. We've got a full hour. I'll probably take about 40 minutes or so and present to you, again, in an interactive way. It's meant to be asked questions, but then we'll also have some time at the end to go down deeper if you'd like to. Okay, so the agenda that I have for today, and I'll ask for your help in making sure this is useful now. So I'll share some background, especially the why, the how, and the what we're doing this. I'll cover the highlights of the Beyond Procurement study now. I've given the pamphlets, or you should have had them in your briefing pack. Feel free to go through them. I'll just touch on this, but I'll share more of the so what's from that study, sort of what's next. I'll talk about the options for growth, there's 10 of them, and how to assess which one is right, in terms of which one fits. Then I'll deep dive on a few selected ones. Total cost-based management is where I've spent most of my last 2 years. So I'd like to share some findings because it's useful. One of the premise is that for procurement to grow, it needs to add something else. Okay, this is a general widespread belief, probably in the private sector, I'm not sure, but you are where you are. You cannot sensitize your stakeholders to give more importance than what you do today. However, there's other things that can be done. Which one is useful to add to your portfolio of activities and grow the scope? This is the focus that I've put on the actual research. I'll cover also some other ones because I thought they might be relevant from discussing with some of you last night. So I'll share some over here. And then I'll give you a general overview of how to implement this. Let's say you pick one or two. What's the right approach? Again, hopefully it's useful in the public sector. But how would you go about driving those and realizing them? Okay, and then afterwards I'll share some things if you'd like to stay engaged. Part of what we're doing also is launching a survey, the survey in the UK specifically. I'd be very grateful if you can take 10 minutes to fill it, and then we'll share the results back with you to see how the public sector compares to the private industry in that same market. Now, before I go down into this, what I was hoping to do, and this is actually, it's a nice size audience, I was hoping to take one of those pens, the blue is correct, right? Okay, one that wipes off the board, and just do a quick tour of the, just understand what people's expectations would be. You know the topic, it's the future. A couple of options, we'll share some thoughts on this. What would you like to hear about? Anything specific that you would expect out of the session this morning? And I'm happy to note those down and make sure that I address them. Yes?
Your experience working with the public sector and challenges, evolution over time, maybe.
Okay, so this is my experience, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Happy to share that. Anything else? Yes, sir.
How the lawyers interact with you in the context of procurement.
How the lawyers.
I have to use a neutral word with interact.
Okay. As opposed to block, annoy, delay, or what? Okay, yes, I got that. You didn't use collaboration, right? Yes, sir.
I was going to say how you manage risk with the lawyers, but how do you just manage risk
Manage risk, okay.
given the globalization?
You make me regret not having put that slide on, but I'll talk to it, sure. Anything else? Sorry.
There are any, what are the key differences between public sector and private sector in the context of procurement?
Key differences, public, private. I'm happy to share on this. You're probably going to have to help me identify the public ones, and I'm sure we can come up with something. I saw a hand. Sorry.
Effects on SMEs into the future, what they have to do to change.
SMEs. Can you be a little bit more specific?
Sorry, effects, defects, not defects.
Sorry. Okay, I was wondering. Can I keep both? Okay, maybe one or two more. I'm happy to add on, and then we'll get started. Yes?
Procurement capacity and capability.
Capacity and capability. This one's interesting. I've spent probably about 3 years looking at what it means to be correctly staffed, skilled, and structured. So the whole organizational model. Okay, this is, I've got a slide on this. One more? Otherwise, we're good to go.
Going back to your point of adding value, maybe onto that last point there. How do you get procurement function to show that it adds value to an organisation?
Organization. Okay, this one I think I will address through the presentation itself, but let's make sure we take it off as well. Okay, so I don't have a clicker, so I will walk back over here to flick those buttons. Okay, a bit of background on myself, just so you understand who's talking to you and why I'm doing this also, you know, my personal motivation. Career in numbers, about 21 years, 22 soon, all of it in procurement, actually. The first 5 were in construction, and then the next 16 or 17 were in pharmaceuticals. Initially, I was with Merck & Company, and then I moved to Novartis. In terms of geography, I'm Canadian originally. I was based in Canada until 2003, and then I moved to Switzerland and Basel to head up initially the European team, and then afterwards all of our global regions. And I'll get to the positions in a second. One of the findings that I've looked in terms of evolving my own career, but also evolving the organization, because I've essentially transformed organizations for most of my time in pharmaceuticals, is there's a lot of relations between what entrepreneurs do, how companies progress, and also how you manage your career or your own organization. And there's an excellent book, I really can't recommend it highly enough. It's called The Startup of You. Anyone who's on LinkedIn, the founder of LinkedIn is Reid Hoffman, that's his book. And he has described concepts that I've used personally in a much, much more simple way. But I will tend to focus on what is it that I like to do, what is it that I'm good at, and then try to figure out what's needed out there. How can I match this? And the way he's built this is actually superb, is what essentially are your aspirations, okay? As a function, just put your procurement hat on now. What are your aspirations as a function? Do you want to drive compliance? Do you want to make a difference? Do you want to add value? Do you want to touch your end customers? Once you got this, what are your assets? What do you have today that's actually useful to get there, okay? And then the last thing is actually matching those with the market realities. What will people pay you for? Now, the answer doesn't have to be the market realities today. Okay, very important. You kind of have a feeling for what's needed today. But think a little bit longer, and we'll come back to that when we build the strategy. Okay, so that's the concept of where you want to go, and essentially what do you have to get you there. And I guess just what's interesting is I've been applying this myself, and I've done about 12 positions in my career, and actually none of them existed before, even my first one. So I've always tried to understand what is needed and try to give it a personal flavor. Here's my interest, and sell the widening of the scope. That's something that's actually easily doable in procurement because of the positioning that we have as a function. So keep that in mind. The concepts that I've got here is, think of this as the capabilities, okay? And think of what's at the bottom. I'm sorry if you can't see in the back. Think of the bottom right corner as the organizational readiness, okay? We're going to come back to those two things because they're the foundation of the research. Okay, a couple of things. Why transform? Now, this is a pretty broad view, but essentially, the procurement leaders, the people that lead the function, have a desire to do more. I think that's probably an understatement. We all want to grow and contribute even more than we do today. But there's also pressure from our management or your sector, your stakeholders in the public sector. But the tendency, the drive, is to always do more with less, faster, but don't change a thing. Right? You cannot disrupt the organization. It makes it kind of hard, right? Because business is what business is, and you have to be confined to a support role. So there's something in that equation which makes it difficult to innovate or to find new ways of driving value. So that's one. Second pressure is coming from the team itself, the people working for you. And this is a study that came out last year. I did not make these numbers up. It is US-based, but it's pretty revealing. This is Procurement's rating for job effectiveness. They've ranked the top 200 jobs in terms of how attractive they are based on a number of factors. And the first position that purchasing actually appears is at number 95. This is for the senior role of purchasing agent. This is the position that we want to draw people from other functions to come in. If you look at the buyer, which is the entry role, well, that's number 149 on this list. So it's pretty low. So if you're thinking you're competing for graduate students who are bright and want to get an attractive career, you've got a lot of competition above that position who want those same people. Now, what was a bit shocking is the positions that came above. So which ones are more attractive than purchasing? The person who prepares taxes came up about 15 positions higher than a buyer role. This one shocked me. Nuclear decontamination technician was number 115. That was 2012, but it was a U.S. study, so I guess they didn't get the impact. They don't know what that means yet. Okay, and parole officer was number 35 on this list. Again, there's a big need for this in the U.S., but it kind of gives you the feeling in terms of maybe something should be done to make the position and the function a little bit more attractive. Okay, so that's the background in terms of why. Now, if I look at how to transform, I'm going to plug in two books here, both of which I like a lot. I met last year with Marshall Goldsmith, who's one of the top executive coaches in the U.S. He coaches the CEO of Pfizer, of Ford, and he's actually done a couple of books. One of them in particular is called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. Okay, and I think there's probably not a single sentence that says it for procurement as much as this one. The function itself did not exist, at least not properly, about 20 years ago. And we've defined it into something great. But where we can go, you have to break what was done because the expectations are a little bit too narrow. So that's some of the foundation here. Now, in understanding the criteria in terms of what to consider moving forward, in discussing with him, he gave me a very nice checklist. And I have to say, I've been applying this personally for the last 12 months. It is fantastic. If something doesn't fit those 5 boxes, I don't do it. Right? Literally, I'll go through them. One is to have content. Let's make this thing be meaningful. The second is to have credibility. People need to trust you and when you communicate that. Very important when we engage with stakeholders. You need to be able to deliver. It's one thing to convince people, but you got to drive it at the end of the day. The last two ones are very often forgotten. Think of procurement now. Keep it simple. We talked about terminology, semantics. Use simple language. Talk the language of your business stakeholders, right? So they can understand you. Keep the concept simple. And the last one, be unique. Every function, every support function out there wants to become a value-created business partner, right? IT, HR, legal, any support function. What makes our contribution unique? That's something to consider. Okay, so these are some tips over here. The last point, which I thought was, again, going back to the aspirations, is if you're not passionate about something, you might as well not do it. You will not do a good job at it. Okay, so this is on the how to transform. And the last piece is looking at what to transform into. And then I'm going to get right into the survey findings. So I don't think I need to go through those boxes. You have the historical trends, if you want, of procurement. You've got the current direction, which is moving away in something that's a little bit more broader contribution, perhaps more appealing, more strategic. But there's a change that's happening here. And the theme that I've saw is that we're moving away from category management, to use that word, to value co-creation, okay, to co-creating something. So there's a piece missing, and we need to partner with someone, whether it's our internal stakeholders, our customers, or suppliers. We need to take on a piece of something else to co-create additional value beyond our immediate scope. And what I've looked at, there's two dimensions in the overall assessment. One is, what is the expected performance? How much do we hope to get out of it? And the second is, how feasible is it? Right? It might be attractive, but if we can't do it, it may not be useful. Okay, so those two axes will come back over and over again. So far, so good? Any questions? Make sense? Okay. Okay, this is the final background slide. We did this thing, I launched it about 2 years ago. We did many workshops, benchmarks, many companies participated. Probably shared this at about 2 or 3 dozen conferences by now. We surveyed a few hundred people, got the feedback in. So it's both qualitative, quantitative. And essentially what we've done is identified the top 10 options and looked at their attractiveness by market and by industry. We've gotten some global results that I'm going to share with you. And now we're expanding this in about 15 countries, hoping to get over 1,000 respondents, and then give us a little bit more clarity even on the specific geography of what's attractive for whom, where. Okay, so this was done with the University of the European Business School. And now we're widening up to essentially 1 university per country that we're getting into. Okay, this is a key slide. All of you are familiar with the content here, but I've tried to synthesize it to really position what we're doing in a way that we can all be aligned. There's a few principles. I've tried to map out the evolution of the function in really simple, overall, aggregated terms. And there's a few concepts behind it. Concept number 1 is that you will have declining returns for whatever you do. Any program that gets rolled out, after about 3 to 5 years, at some point you start to see declining returns. The second is, as you advance, there's also growing hurdles. It gets more difficult to move to the next thing because of what it is. I'll show you that in a second. The third is that the focus changes. You actually switch the focus from process to external view to internal view to something else. The last is that the reporting line also probably needs to change. Very often procurement has started off in the directs area, buying production materials, so you report to production, manufacturing. Once you start to expand to the overall spend, again, I'm talking industry now, very often the reporting line has moved to the CFO to give it the broader, central, give it a bit more bite, if you want, for the compliance piece. But again, at some point, as you start to expand what you want to do, maybe it's time to look for maybe another home. Someplace that is not so financially driven. So just some thoughts again, but the evolution will probably call this out. So what are those steps? The first one is, I think you'll agree with me, is moving from non-centralized to centralized, right? This is traditional purchasing. You essentially stop the bleeding. You make sure that people don't spend unnecessarily. And the focus is usually on savings and compliance. Because you buy better, you save money. And there's a compliance factor that gets into it. The hurdle to get this done correctly is systems and process. Once you've got this, it becomes a little bit more free-flowing. After a couple of years, we move on to strategic procurement. A lot of you are probably in this now, and this is the whole notion of category management. The focus becomes external. You look at how do you manage your supply base, longer-term agreements, you aggregate volume, you consolidate your supplier base, right? And then the expertise, the skill that is needed, well, the skill is the hurdle, but the skill that is needed is market knowledge and category expertise, right? After a couple of years, again, you've got your long-term contracts, you're paying the right price, you've switched the vendors, and we move on to what I labeled pretty simply spend optimization. The focus there, and this is now my own experience now, the focus becomes a lot more internal. Okay, you work with the stakeholders not to buy their requirements effectively, but to challenge their needs. Okay, you have to understand the needs of the stakeholders. This is where you have upstream decision involvement, right? And the hurdle there is acceptance. You need to be accepted to talk to them and challenge them in a way that they will essentially be comfortable with. right? And that's roughly called demand management or process management. You change what you buy and you change how you buy it. The basic evolution, 3 to 5 years to go through all of these steps, and at some point you hit the wall. So what we try to look at is two things. What's on the other side of that wall, and then how do you jump it? Because it really is a wall. Usually what I've seen from when companies get here, they kind of go back and they pick up the missing pieces. They improve something else that was done, but they do it better. It's not about moving forward because the expectations are set. So, the options themselves, and I've got a slide that covers those. I'll probably take 5 minutes to cover each of those individually so you know what they are, but I will not cover them all in great details, unless somebody wants to know more about something. And by the way, they're in your book, so if you want to read through them as we're going through, you've got access to. Okay, so let me hit them. The first one, which I was describing before, is how do you take an internal capability and drive it to deliver top-line growth? Think of my hospital project that I've mentioned before. Second one is innovation sourcing. This one is interesting. Everybody wants to do innovation. People usually don't know how, and they don't know how to measure it. So what we've looked at is really two factors. Number one is how do you create the spark for the innovation? And the initial findings is that it doesn't come from collaboration. It doesn't come from a nice environment where you put money in. It's usually accidental, and it comes from having a panic response to something, that you trigger a crazy thought that, interesting, could work. The second thing is once you have the spark, how do you make sure it doesn't get killed through the internal review process? If it hasn't been done before, if you can't measure it, chances are it will not get through all the way. Okay? So that's the sourcing innovation piece. Third piece is total cost-based management. I will spend a lot of time talking about this, but it's putting anything which saves money for the company together under one organization. So we're actually going to touch on this with the subject matter experts, not the defects, but the effects. You put the subject matter experts together, but no longer as independent functions. Okay, and I'll show you, I think I've got the organizational model slide. Global business services, everyone know what that is? Okay, removing any non-customer facing functions, you centralize them, and then you deliver it more efficiently, usually regionally or globally, and you can also outsource that. The fifth one is comprehensive risk management. That's a question that came up. I won't cover it in details, but it has to do with going wider and a little bit deeper as well into the managing the risk for the organization. Very often what you see is that buying organizations, they will manage their strategic vendors, understand who they are, check them out, but it's usually not based on the risk. Risk is the probability something will happen, with the impact that it's going to have once it happens. So changing the formula, trying to mitigate the impact up front, not just identifying it, but actually trying to prevent it from happening, and also going deeper in the supply chain. So going into your second and third tier level vendors. Roughly that's what it is. If procurement becomes really good at that, they can actually start to influence the risk management with the customers. But that's a step forward as well. Okay, so that's on this side. Moving on to box number 6, take over operational activities. This is actually owning a part of the service delivery for the business. Very often in the private sector, we end up outsourcing functions that don't have a natural owner anymore. There's no more travel managers within company. There's no more fleet managers. You outsource facility management as well. So by default, you become the operator of that function because you manage the relation with the vendor, but you also manage the performance. 7 is next level collaborative buying. This is interesting for the public sector now. This is essentially consortium buying on steroids. It's actually setting up companies, formal companies that buy this for a living and that sell back to the original companies which form this. But for all purposes, the head of sourcing becomes the CEO of that company, and you see this happening more and more within large industries. Internal consulting project management, many of the projects that we do have a project management feel to it. You're not just buying, you're managing different relationships, timelines, budgets, deliverables. That's project management. There's no other function in a company that does that or that is known for it. So there's a way to elevate ourselves and do that. 9th is SRM as value creation. This one I will cover also because it's very, very interesting. It has to do with going beyond SRM. SRM is managing the performance typically with vendors. But how do you understand as a buying organizations, and think of this for the public sector, how do you manage and understand what your overall challenges are, what your opportunities are, And then how do you look in your vendor base for that unique capability which matches that problem? Then how do you get them together and how do you get acceptance from the business to consider doing that? I'd be actually interested to get your thoughts on this, because I can't work out how much flexibility you might have to incentivize the vendors to want to collaborate with you and drive unique solutions to solve public sector issues, but it could be interesting to discuss. Okay. The last one is provocative, and think of this as returning money to shareholders. If you cannot deliver additional value as a procurement organization, and you've centralized and you've got a robust process in place, one of the options is actually to dismantle the function. You may not need to have a chief procurement officer buying all of that if you've got steady compliance coming through. Also outsourceable. So if you can't increase the ROI by increasing the return, then decreasing the cost is the next option. So it's a bit of a caution as well, but it's a real possibility. Okay. Any questions on those options? Because I'm not going to come back to all of them afterwards.
I'm interested in the SRM, relationship management. Obviously within the public sector that presents many problems in terms of transparency. How would you see SMR working, where obviously from a public sector perspective, your engagement with suppliers tend to be much more rigorous and open to question and trying to drive better value? I mean, in my terms, SRM, we work with the 10, 12, 15 top suppliers. We have a multitude of public sector contracts to try and set more value. It's the link between SRM and particularly innovation.
It's a very good point.
To me, you're looking towards your SMRM to say, here are major problems in the public sector. Can you give us a solution without having to commit any money?
Well,
and share risk.
Yeah, the committing of money is, honestly, I don't see it as a major challenge from that perspective. The issue I have is the incentivization of the supplier that you want to do this with. In the public sector procurement, I think your hands are relatively tied. If I look at the incentive from a vendor's perspective, you all know the category management box, buy, leverage, strategic, right? So you typically want to add more value. If you're a vendor, you want to give something which removes you from being a commodity. You want to distinguish yourself by having a unique offering, which makes you indispensable. Let's put it this way. But what does it mean to be indispensable in the public sector procurement? That's the issue. If I'm looking at the private sector, the minute that you put in place a preferred relation with the vendor, his competitor is trying to lowball him to get back in. It's that simple, right? So they'll take jobs at a loss to get back in your market so they'll be able to distinguish themselves. And anyone that either has, I don't want to say narrow-minded management, but a management focused on cost or overly tight policies and procedures will need to consider the low bidder. Otherwise, you're burning money from the corporation from who you're working. That's the challenge. Very often, the value that you're seeking to generate is not quantifiable. Right? It can solve a real problem, but how do you compare it? How do you quantify that? And it's not in your objectives.
Who owns the IPR?
The what, sorry?
Intellectual property of that problem. Supplier will come in, but once retain
Totally
IPR,
understand.
Therefore,
I completely.
holding the IPR, they hold the control. So.
I completely understand. I mean, the IPR for me is secondary. I think if a supplier develops it, he can certainly own it. The one, and I'm brainstorming with you now. If you cannot give a financial incentive to a vendor to address something unique, I think there could be something in terms of the clout that this can bring, the endorsement for him to take this back to the private sector and milk the idea for all that it's worth. So if you're developing something that gets adopted by large institutions that addresses a well-known problem that gets huge kind of recognition, publicity and all that comes with it, I'm sure they can leverage that to produce a new offer they can then go back and sell. But the profitability may not come from the public sector. That's my own personal thoughts on this. Yeah? Okay. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. So we've got 10 options. Now, we did not rank them. They started from a number of 30. We've consolidated some of those. And there's others as well. I'm not saying this is all-inclusive, but it's probably not a bad starting point. I haven't had much disagreement towards this that it's not meaningful. The one question that has come up is, why is there no options linked to technology? And my answer is that technology, in my mind, is an enabler to many of those, but it's not a distinct option. That's my simple answer to the one objection that I've gotten from presenting this. Okay, so what did the findings tell you? This is directly a slide from your book now. So the survey that I've asked actually had 3 questions, and 3 questions only, which meant that we got some decent responses. What have you done? How much did it deliver? What do you plan on doing? How much do you think it will deliver? And how feasible do you think it is for those 10 options? That was it. This one here shows the performance results. So we've aggregated the expected returns with the intention of doing it. And the bars in yellow show the top 3 options: sourcing innovation, TCBM, and also GBS. This is what was done in the past. Looking into the future, the top 2 stay the same, but SRM actually gets into number 3. And in the last, from what I've seen the answers over the last 6 months, that one has grown, and collaborative buying also has grown a lot. This is kind of the trend that I'm seeing now, but I'll have the results in probably 2 more months. This one's interesting. Now we're getting into the feasibility. And feasibility, the way we've defined it, is how ready is the organization to receive versus how capable is procurement at delivering it. And if you look at the global numbers, well, there's a correlation, but it doesn't tell you that much. I mean, overall, it's kind of spread linear. Doesn't really reveal all that much. There's a couple of things that stand out. Risk management is the one that is in the top right quadrants that typically people would like to do more of, and they'd like to see more as well. But overall, other than those 4, the rest is kind of here. Now, if you're in the bottom right corner, you probably want to look, this is procurement being able to do, but the business isn't ready. Then how do you influence the business to want to do more? And if the business needs it and you can't do it, maybe you want to become good at that and bring it onto here. So again, it's understandable, but there's nothing totally revealing about this. When we looked at the responses by respondents, it was a lot more interesting. So we singled out procurement, business stakeholders, management, and the CFO. The procurement view is undecided. They're all bundled in the middle. They're waiting for a direction. Okay, tell me what's next and I'll do it, right? My interpretation, right? The COO, CEO, there's plenty of things that you can do, but no. Right? There's not a particular interest. The red dot is risk management, by the way. Business, top line growth, got to do more, the sky's the limit, anything goes. Absolutely anything goes. There's a huge attraction to do whatever to support them. And the CFO, where most procurement functions report today, stay focused. That word comes a lot, stay focused, right? Think of your role and think of how much fits within the CFO's overall. They're looking at compliance, savings, and day payables outstanding. These are all critical. I'm not saying don't do those, not at all, but that's it, right? So adding another form of intangible value may not be that relevant, especially when the finance organization is under pressure to keep its resources down, right? And deliver on its objectives with the minimum resources possible, like everyone else. So that focus is actually counterproductive if you want to grow your scope. Did you have a question? Yes.
Just a comment really, in support of that, because I've often argued that procurement has to align its objectives with those of the organisation.
Absolutely.
But the problem is different stakeholders in the organisation, like the managing director and like the finance director, actually have different objectives.
No question.
And therefore there is an issue for procurement as to how it manages these different very influential stakeholders.
I couldn't agree with you more. If I could just, I'll tell a quick story in reference to this. I left the operations role in 2009 because times were bad for us. We were having, in pharmaceuticals, the worst thing that can happen is you can get a product recalled, you can have an early entrant that's competition you do not foresee, and you can have a promising product rejected, okay? We had all 3 happen in the same quarter. So the organization panicked and cranked up the switch in terms of how can you save a lot more money. If you can't grow the top line, you grow the bottom line, of course, right? So built this killer plan that essentially would save the organization tons of money. By the time it got delivered, we're back in top line growth mode again. The crisis is gone, we're doing good, we've got to grow sales again. So you need to be able to adjust, and that's where all the options come in. Sometimes saving money is not the end goal. What do you do if that's not the focus? You know, other than dismantling the function, you could be able to do something else. I'll come back to that strategy, actually. It's a very critical point. Okay, any other ahas or no? Overall makes sense? Okay. I don't have much more specific data. I will have more in the future. The only other slide that I have that I thought the contrast was nice is between North America and Europe. Now, the timing was important. We did this thing in May of last year. If you look at Europe, it's total risk aversion. This was just as the euro was starting to get awfully challenged. Is they going to make it through summer, right? So don't do anything except maybe cover for risk. Look at North America. They're actually past the crisis. They're 2 years into it. They're looking as a way out of it. So absolutely no appetite for risk management, but a lot of interest for the other things that could potentially add some kind of value. So culture and situation also are factors which influence the appetite. Right? So I think back to the strategy and back to having, I don't want to say a repertoire, but having a range of things that you can do is very useful as a procurement function. Okay, that's it for the findings actually. What I probably would like to do is if we end up doing the public survey, the public sector survey, is perhaps share the findings back with either the organizers, the university, but get the numbers back to you so you can also compare your own sector with the others. I think that might be insightful. Okay, now we're getting into the meat of things. I will talk about total cost-based management, and I'll use a slide which I've actually used with our own management as a bit of a backup here. Quick question to the audience, don't have to look at those boxes necessarily. How do you save money? There's 4 things you can do to save money, and only 4.
Reduce cost, reduce demand.
Okay, buy cheaper, buy less.
Yeah.
Okay, what else?
Aggregate and get better value.
Tell me more.
Aggregate the demand for goods. If there's a significant amount of diffusion across the company or organization or sector.
Okay, you're right,
put it all together.
but that's how. You're right, but it will either influence the demand or the price. You're right.
Buy differently, actually.
Buy
Buy different product services.
Different, okay. So you're on the demand, you're right.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Stop value, destroying value when you have crises that come in and shut you down.
Okay, that's protection. You're absolutely right, but that's protection. You're absolutely right. Think more to this, the right-hand side now. We can buy less and we can buy cheaper, but there's 2 other things that are not related to buying that companies can do.
Efficiency.
Efficiency is okay. What's the impact of efficiency?
Well, the cost to serve of the actual logistics or whatever, or
Okay.
how you then making values.
Okay, let me accelerate this a little bit more. Efficiencies, you eventually need less people.
Yeah.
Okay, so just, you're pushing this to the extreme. The last thing you can do is sell things. Okay, you can dispose of assets. Essentially, if you think about this a little bit, that's the only 4 things that you can do. There's different ways of getting to this, but that's the 4 things. Okay? And historically, what I've seen, I mean, myself and I think most companies will go through that, is the focus has been on buying cheaper. Right? You focus on buying cheaper because there's a belief that you're overpaying. Just get it cheaper. The vendor's making a lot of profit. But that's the you keep beating on that element. And part of the notion, and again, it's a bit of a simple process, we buy cheaper until we can't buy any cheaper, okay? Then the next thing once this happens is I can't reduce my cost anymore, then you switch to your internal cost. Do I need all these people, right? And then you're looking, can I offshore or can I outsource, some of my resources? And then you do this in usually a reactive way to save money, which should not be the main driver for offshoring and outsourcing, but you do this. And then typically we ship a broken process to a third-party solution provider. What happens? They don't know how to handle it, the costs go up, and then we need to fix the process, right? So overall, it's not, the sequence is important. And my thought in putting this together is trying to see how do you bring all of the elements that influence the entire cost-saving range? People, resources, assets, process, vendors, all of that. And we've labeled it total cost-based management. But the notion is that you do the sequencing right. First, you address the process of something. Once you've got the process right, then you look at the right delivery model. Do I do it in-house or do I do it outsourced? And there's a logic that goes behind that. And once you decide what you will not do in-house, then you buy it. And then you buy it through the best process that you can. That sequence, I'll give you a couple of examples, I think is applicable to a certain point in the public sector. The logic is there. And the intention is to give procurement some additional tools and processes that could widen the range of its offering. Okay? Very often a procurement person will come into a situation, they will quickly understand the problem. They will even be able to come up with the solution, but they will not be able to implement it. And that I guarantee is true in the public sector, because the solution owner, holder, is somewhere else. Right? You've got to go to a higher authority. In my hospital projects, we identified what the issues are. Part of the solutions lied with the physicians. The physicians are not paid by the hospital. They're paid by the regional government, for instance. Right? So you need to broaden the scope a little bit more and the tools. So that's what this thing does. It actually puts all of those productivity enablers together. At a minimum starting point, train procurement on Lean Six Sigma. That is a quick win that anyone can do. It will automatically broaden the horizons and give more credibility. Okay? So,
Just asked you about,
Sorry.
you said about Six Sigma. Lean obviously is all about getting processes to
Mm-hmm.
flow, remove barriers. And how do you see Lean operating in there within the triangle? Because Six Sigma agree improves continuity, improves quality, and gets stuff.
Yeah.
Lean's about process and flow, and particularly in respect of your procurement processes and flow.
Sure.
You know, so how do you apply Lean particularly to the procurement process?
Sure. It's actually, I would say Lean is probably much more useful than Six Sigma. Lean is it's not about the quality, it's about cutting the waste.
That's right.
So fundamentally, you will do, for anything you do, you will do your process map. You will look at the activities, what feeds, what goes out. And then from then on, you identify what adds value, what doesn't add value. And then you typically remove the types of waste from the operations that reduce the cost. And value is something, either there's a transformation, something that the customer is willing to pay for. So any rework, wait time, things like that, you would remove. So of those two things, Lean is easier and probably more applicable to the procurement and the procurement field.
Driving Lean down through the supply chain as well, not just down to your second, third, fourth tiers, because Lean, to be effective, must run down the supply chain.
Yeah.
Briefly, how did you apply that, or did you apply that?
Partially. What you find typically is that your vendors are better at you, at managing the Lean part of their organization. The initial intention, when I looked at the options, the initial thing was to extend Lean to our suppliers. Now, one finding is that the higher you move up in the chain, the less they are good at that. So instead of us helping our suppliers, what I found is that our suppliers are better than us at driving Lean. So I've started to help our customers with Lean. So we reverse the offering. Okay. Okay. Any other questions on this one? Good. Okay. Do I need to get into I've got some slides, I'm not sure I need to cover them. Everyone knows what demand management is? Okay, I won't cover this slide. I just will show one thing which actually exemplifies for me in common terminology what exactly it means. Historically, you've got, somebody has a need. There's a business need somewhere, right? Sell more, please a customer, whatever that may be. And the user typically will interpret that need and produce some kind of a requirement specification, usually like a technical requirement specification. And that is the starting point for having purchasing involved. There's a specification, I need to meet that requirement. Let me go to the market and try to get this for as little as I can. In some cases, you might be able to challenge the requirement and move up a little bit more. But your starting point is still the requirements. You're starting with someone's interpretation, right? The notion of demand management, to do it correctly, is that you want to be involved upstream, working with your stakeholder for him to develop the requirement which will meet the business need. Now that's very important. This goes back to the strategy here. My personal strategy has always been to not work for the business, but work with the business, right? For instance, I would not be that interested in the internal satisfaction surveys. Within limits, yes, but it's not how much do you bend over backwards to please your stakeholders. It's really how much do you align with him and with finance to meet the ultimate business need and create value, right? So this is a fundamental, but if you've got that mindset, then that's probably the area of involvement. But you need skills and acceptance, right? So there's a bit of a hurdle to get there. Does that make sense to everyone? Getting involved up front, the need definition, yeah? Okay.
Sorry to come in.
Yeah,
one of the
please.
difference in the public sector is not necessarily specification, what's the desired outcome? It's linking policy to outcome, which may or may not be a specification, and procurement may or may not influence it. So it's a different model. So it's not everything refers to requirements or specifications, but it's outcomes linked to policies, and that's really related to the commissioning process. Which is where public sector can sometimes differ from a private sector model, but the same thing can apply.
I like this a lot. It brings a thought from one of the questions that was asked. Maybe what are some of the differences, or how can you leverage this in the public sector? The issue for me is that everything needs to be quantified. Fits a very disciplined methodology. I think the one chance that you have of influencing, and even private sector, is in the evaluation sheet. So that's when you factor in the price versus the other criterias. There's a way to significantly increase the weight for innovation, value-added services, addresses one of our unmet needs, so that pricing doesn't become the differentiator. And I think actually, and part of working with vendors as well, is issuing functional requirement specification versus technical requirement specification. Say what you wanted to do and let them figure out how they will do that, with a statement that the lowest bidder will not be the one that will be retained necessarily. Maybe I'm being simple here for the discussion.
What I'm trying to say, that there can be non-economic drivers as well as economic drivers in terms of public procurement. That's equally important politically.
I completely agree with you, but you still need to quantify during the evaluation method. Otherwise, the lowest bidder will scream that you're blowing away public money for going with someone else. I come from Montreal, and we're having a crisis right now with this. I saw it 20 years ago building up, and now it is so widespread that it's very hard to revert back. But the broken process has become the process. Okay. Is everyone familiar with Lean Six Sigma? Yeah? Okay. So the process, the notion here is why I've got this slide is the process of defining, measure, analyzing, improving, and controlling. They actually align somehow with the category management process. And so does the offshoring and outsourcing process. So different methodology, different tools, but yet they fit together. That's the takeaway that I wanted to share here. And I will skip the offshoring and outsourcing. Okay, that was the piece that I had on total cost-based management. I've added 2 examples, and they're relatively short. I've got 1 slide for each, which is stuff that I've done on the other options, right? So this one here is the top line growth. The starting point for this, and I think the reasoning is probably more meaningful for you than the outcome, is looking at, what is it that I'm looking after, and what are my stakeholders and what are their needs as well. And if I'm looking at the pharmaceutical, we have a huge change of commercial model. It used to be that you would push out sales reps to doctors, try to display the uniqueness and effectiveness of your drugs and get them prescribed. That's becoming very challenging. That's not happening anymore. Hospitals have huge pressure on cost and efficiency. And patients ultimately are confused and at risk. The challenge that we're facing, it's almost a perfect storm. You have a rise of volume, so there's more and more people that need access to medicine and therapy. There's the quality issue that the wait time is longer, that you're being pushed to other kinds of therapy, and ultimately there's a desire to reduce costs. So that was kind of the equation. Broadening the scope of procurement and even my own stakeholders, pharmaceuticals tends to be about 20% of the total healthcare cost. Yet that's the area that gets picked on the most for the pricing for many different reasons, which I won't get into. But the point is that the other 80% may not be addressed as well as it could be. So my thought was take what I've got within that 20%, which is a very small downstream portion, elevate it and offer it to people that have unmet needs in this area. And that's essentially what I've done with the hospitals. Going to them and training them on Lean Six Sigma, on productivity, giving advice in terms of how they can remove costs somewhere else and ultimately benefit the patients by removing an obstacle. Okay? Won't get into it more, but this is just one application of things that you can take. Now, when I say use your capability, it doesn't have to be outside the public sector itself. But where other than in that piece of the process that you are now, could what you do be useful somewhere else? Could be really anywhere. Okay, but it's a provocative thought that maybe could drive some reflection. The other piece that I like a lot is the SRM as a value creation. Now, the foundation here, and this is actually where most of my next interest is going into. We're setting up some groups on that. Typically, you have a supplier and you have a buyer. And there's a commercial transaction that's put in place. And if you might have a long-term contract put in place and you might call him preferred. But fundamentally, you will make sure that he meets the expected value, the right performance levels, whatever indicators you may track. The intention is not to go above that. The intention is to make sure that people comply with it. You use that vendor, you sell me at that price, you give me that quality of service. And the thought here is that, okay, let's broaden this a bit more. Do I have any unmet needs? I come back with that word a lot. I like it because nobody fights for unmet needs, right? You're not competing with someone. What are the challenges that you're facing? What are the opportunities that you have? And then how do you identify the unique capabilities in your vendors that could be able to address those? I didn't talk about the incentive yet, but that's the logic behind it. So reasoning number one is look for that. It's even more interesting if some of what he comes up with can actually flow and be visible to the end customer. That makes that vendor even more unique and indispensable. Right? So the attractiveness for suppliers to commit and invest in this, should they get the prize of getting something that goes all the way through, is actually quite high. Right? It doesn't have to be only financial, as we talked about. It could be something unique that positions them differently in the marketplace as well. And the example, I think the example may not be so relevant for you, but it's the one that I chose is an outsourced service provider. For all purposes, they provide different types of positions and roles that they fill externally. And looking at the needs, they saw two things happen. One is that in the emerging markets, very few pharma companies still see doctors. Doctors really don't want to see reps anymore. but yet they still need to get the medical information that reps would convey normally. At the same time, in developed countries, you have a lot of patients that are picking up and not self-prescribing, but they're finding out a lot more about their prescriptions, their disease areas, and so on. So they've actually created almost like a virtual rep office that doctors and patients can consult with all this data. And essentially, it's sponsored. It's actually done by the companies, but it's done in a way which is completely legit, and it meets the new realities. So the basic offering turned into some value and is visible to the end customer, both the patients and the physicians. And there's many examples of those, actually. Okay, I think that's it for the options. In terms of time, we've got 15 minutes left. So I'll just wrap up with a couple of things and then open up. One is back to the strategy. That's really the first step in looking at how to implement it. So usually, if I share and talk to people, okay, I understand the why. I got the idea for the options. How do I do this? The steps are relatively simple. They get more complicated during, but there's a sequence to be maintained. The first is most organizations do not have a procurement or productivity strategy. You typically have objectives that respond to the actual needs and kind of drill down into individual objectives. What's the strategy, right? And the strategy has different things. It's got the vision and mission, of course, but that's a given. But more importantly, it's got what's the operating model that you want to go in? What are your capabilities that you want to offer so you're able to draw from those? It doesn't have to be only save money. It could be something else, right? So that's for you to assemble. And out of this thing, starting, of course, with what is the overall company or organization need, you derive your own strategy, and that strategy will tell you which options are right for you, if any of them. Now, in that case here, I've chosen TCBM because that's what I wanted to explore. If we go with that option, then there's really two components. One is to integrate those things together, to make them aligned. Then it's to manage this new organization altogether as a whole. I don't have the, somebody asked me for the model. I don't have the slide with me. I apologize. I can draw it maybe afterwards. Anyway, so you manage this. And then there's two things that you need to do, and really two things only. One is to raise the organizational readiness. Where is it positioned? Remove the obstacles. Change management, of course, right? And then the last one is to build the capabilities. Now, I guarantee you one thing is whichever option you choose, you will not have the required skills to drive it on day one. So how do you get that? Do you draw people from outside to your function? Do you hire? Do you develop? How do you retain? There's different strategies against that. But the whole capability building plan needs to come in there. Okay, that's a snapshot of the overview. There's more behind it, but just on a high level, I'm sure each of you has different processes to address those three components there. Couple of things in staying engaged, and then I've got a few more slides that I'll use to answer the questions. I do a monthly blog. If you look me up on LinkedIn or on just Google me, there's a blog called Beyond Procurement, which I've actually covered a more narrative view of all that I've covered in this. I do once a month usually. I'm doing a new one called Beyond SRM, which will explore the SRM specifically in more details. The survey, you will get the link from the conference organizer. Again, grateful if you can fill it. Tick off the public sector box in terms of the industry. Fill it as best as you can, as honestly as you can, and we'll share the feedback with you in a very simple overview, 2 slides, and you'll be able to use those somehow, hopefully. We also do deep dive research interviews if anyone's interested in participating or contributing. Also do in-company or in-public sector workshops if somebody wants to know more. It's always interesting because you get a lot of insights from those discussions. And the last 2 ones may not be that meaningful for you, but launching something productivity in pharma. The process that I mapped, I'm setting up a 3-part one-day workshops. One is with pharma companies, what are the needs and challenges? The second was with the supply base, how do you what are the unique capabilities? And then bringing them together with how do you match those things to really try to demonstrate the outcome of this. Okay, and you will get these slides, by the way, so all of this is linked on. I mentioned before I'm Canadian, so the whole discussion at the table yesterday was football. Me, it's ice hockey. There's a couple of things. This is the person who essentially, I'm not sure who's familiar, he essentially wrote the record book for hockey in Canada, Wayne Gretzky. And he was asked a lot of questions on how he did it. And he had 2 answers, both of which I liked a lot and I think are applicable for us. One is that you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. Unless you try something, you won't score. So give it a shot, literally give it a shot. If it's something you feel is doable, why not take a step towards it? The second piece, and I'm closing with what I said earlier, is that you skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck is. So look around you today, this is the situation. trying to knock on someone's door to do more and offer more today, chances are they don't care. Everyone's busy doing something. Take a step back, try to look 12 months.